start turning the recording on right now. And otherwise, that's all I have to say. We can get started. I'm going to let Adam Ford introduce our speaker and the topic for today.
Welcome, everybody, wherever you're tuning in from. Yeah, I was the handling editor on this paper, so I'm pleased to introduce the lead author, Hanna Pettersson, who is currently based at the University of Leeds in the UK, but is physically right now in Spain working on research related to coexistence. But today she's going to speak to us about her paper published earlier this year called Rewilding and Gazetting in the Ibera National Park, using an asset-based approach or an asset approach to evaluate project success that was co-authored by herself and Sergio Carballo. I'm really excited about this paper because it kind of brings together a number of challenges that creating national parks and managing protected areas brings up in a lot of places. But what I liked about this is it's a good news story, I feel, and we need some of that in the world right now. And I think it's okay to talk about problems, but here Hanna has shown us a way of sort of articulating pathways to success, and I think that's an important part of conservation in the 2020s, especially this year. So with that, Hanna, please take us away, and thank you for agreeing to do this presentation today.
Well, first of all, hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in, and thanks so much, Adam, for the introduction. So I would also like to thank the Society of Conservation Biology for letting me present. It's, even though I can't see you guys, it's good to be able to connect with you all in these kind of weird times that we find ourselves in. And so, as Adam mentioned, I'm here today to talk about some research that I did in 2017 when I was still based at the University of Oxford. And as he mentioned, co-authored with Sergio, my colleague at the School of Geography and the Environment, who helped me refine this paper into its current format. So I'll just briefly go through the outline of today's presentation, just so you can keep yourselves in the loop. And it roughly follows the outline of the paper itself. And I will keep it certain sections quite brief, so I do encourage you to check out the paper if you want any more details of anything, or just shoot me a question afterwards. I'll begin by giving you some background, briefly along the lines of what Adam was talking about, and then introduce you to the case study area, and then go through the results with the paper, and then some further discussions and some questions at the end. So let's just return briefly to the topic of the seminar series here, emerging issues in conservation. And the particular issue I wanted to talk about today is connected to this quite hopeful trend around which there's this increasing buzz in both the academic community and popular sector alike, nature restoration and rewilding. I see these Facebook groups and projects and different initiatives popping up new almost weekly now. And you could kind of trace this back to trends of well, different drivers, for instance, environmental awareness, rural depopulation. So these initiatives come up to try to restore habitats and landscapes that have been degraded for some reason, and also to reconnect people. And when I speak about rewilding today, I will refer to a process-oriented approach, which aim to increase the scale of wildness in a particular place, along the lines roughly defined here by Navarro and Pereira. So the passive management of ecological succession with the goal of restoring natural ecosystem processes and reducing human controlled landscapes. And it often involves the reintroduction of species, but it doesn't have to. And it's usually a scale approach where you can just amp up the restoration in a particular place. And for me, it's one of these very hope-inspiring trends to address both the climate and the biodiversity crisis, and as I said, engage people in the process. But of course, just as with the designation of protected areas, rewilding comes with many challenges. And what I wanted to talk about today, and the topic of the paper, is how to achieve legitimacy among local people for such initiatives, how to get people aboard, and how projects can be carried out in a way that respects and integrate local culture and traditions. So, because justifying and designating areas for wildness instead of agricultural production, for example, or other urgent human needs, particularly in developing areas, is a key issue for conservation. And if managers fail to do this in a good way, well, the project will most likely not be very sustainable in the long term. So the aim of this research was to explore a project that has done comparatively well at managing these challenges and to understand the mechanisms that help them succeed. So to do this, we analyzed a rewilding project and a national park designation project in the Ibera National Reserve in Argentina. And the project involves the establishment of a national park and the reintroduction of several keystone flagship species, however you want to call them, to an area that was quite, well, an agricultural area, essentially. And for me, this project is particularly interesting because, in terms of legitimacy, I should say, because the idea was conceived by a couple of North American philanthropists that came into this area and purchased big areas of land. And this was, just to put it mildly, not necessarily very popular with the local people. So I will begin just giving you some social and ecological context of the area. So Esteros de Ibera is one of the largest wetlands in the world, and it's also a very important freshwater reservoir. So it's obviously in Argentina, and at 500,000 hectares, it covers almost 15% of the region of Corrientes in northern Argentina. See if we can find my mouse here. So yeah, here we have Corrientes, and here it is in Argentina. And it's also a very biodiverse area. In Corrientes, the region is one of the poorest regions in Argentina, subsisting mainly of cattle ranching, rice plantations, and forestry, managed traditionally by these guys, gauchos, which is the Argentine version of the cowboy. So a very male-dominated profession, obviously. And in the rest of Argentina, the region is considered quite a conservative place and was previously not very much on the map, neither for local politicians or tourists. It was basically a region that you passed through in order to get up to the region above, which is called Misiones, which is where you can find the Iguazu waterfalls. And just return to the map here. So the Ibera wetlands consist of two parts. So we have these surrounding areas that are where the human activities are taking place, which is made quite dry. And then we have what I call the wetland core, which is not inhabitable, or you can't really produce there. It's simply too wet. But it has, even so, always been exploited. So hunters used to go into the wetlands by boats in order to take out fur, skin, and feathers and other things that they sold on what was once a quite bolstering fur trade. And this process obviously was contributing to an extinction of several species, so both birds, reptiles, and mammals in the area. But in 1983, the wetland core, so that wet bit in the middle, was made into a provincial reserve by the local government. And although it was primarily to protect the water reserves, it did help the fauna, the remaining fauna, to be protected. And there was some installation of local park guards and such. So it started little by little to bounce back. And it also helped, I'm going to return them up again, to little by little begin a little ecotourism business here in the little city here called Carlos Pellegrini. So a few hostels started to pop up. Because it's the only village within the wetland that had direct entry into the wet core, as I mentioned. The other areas that you see, the villages around here, are all cut off by private land, so they couldn't really access. Anyway, so there was some ecotourism popping up there. Even so, the wetlands by the local administration was considered quite a financial and bureaucratic burden because of the increasingly stringent ecological rules that became applied. So this quote here told. Hello, we have some sound here. Anyway, I'll just hang on a minute to see that. Cool. This quote was told to me by one of the senators in Ibera. So Ibera has been on the agenda for 20 years, but as a páramo that we had to deal with without knowing why, it had no productive value, it was a waste. So this was kind of the context. I'm just setting the scene here for when these two Americans popped in. Switch paper here. So the two Americans that I'm referring to are Douglas and Christine Tompkins, and they are perhaps most associated with the clothing brands of the North Face and Patagonia, and also for being the driving force behind a similar project in the south of Chile, in Patagonia there, to create a national park and do some landscape restoration. So they have been quite a lot in the news, and very sadly, Douglas passed away in 2016, but Christine is very much still involved in the project and keeps spearheading it. So what they did when they entered, which is 23 years ago now, is to start buying land, basically. So these brown bits that you can see here, this is a map that is from the project, is land that they purchased little by little. They were old farms, private land, that over the years have come to amount more than 150,000 hectares. And they manage these lands through their conservation NGO, which is called the Conservation Land Trust. I will call them CLT from now on, so you can keep up. And the aims and their objectives with this project was basically to create an ecologically complete area. So what the NGO does basically is to buy land, restore it, and then donate it back to the national government in question, in this case Argentina, on the condition that it is made into a national park to conserve it in perpetuity, basically. Although this sounds perhaps good, it was not necessarily very popular with local people who were very much trying to make ends meet, and local politicians were very focused on trying to develop the area. So around this time when they entered, there were quite a lot of conspiracy theories about this American people showing up, that they were perhaps affiliated with the CIA on a mission to colonize Argentina's freshwater, because it's, as I mentioned, an important freshwater reserve, and that the conservation project was just a pretense for land grabbing, basically. So to put it simply, it was just a fiercely opposed project locally. And the objectives of my research is basically to try to explore the key actions that made this situation 20 years ago into what we have now, which is basically, let's see, there we go. Because now it is Ibera, the Park of Ibera is not only Argentina's largest continuous protected area, it is also becoming quite famous internationally as an ecotourism destination, and also as a positive example for both rewilding and community-based conservation. And the excitement of the project has actually just grown since I finished this research 3 years ago. Just the other day, actually, I saw this short film within a project run by National Geographic, which is called The Last Wild Places, about the project, and just one other one, describing it just as one of those successful examples of how we can work with local people to conserve and restore nature. So basically what I wanted to know is, what were the key mechanisms that enable these transitions, and what did local people feel about them? So in this presentation, I will focus on what CLT did that worked, since I think it's essential to build on positive developments and try to amplify this, right? This does of course not mean that there were no issues with this project, and there are no problems right now. I do talk a little bit more about the challenges and problems in the publication. So if you're more curious about that, either shoot me a question or just look it up afterwards. I'm very happy to develop that bit further if you're interested. In order to explore what made the project successful, I conducted participant observation and key informant interviews at the site in 2017 and the summer of 2017. And I also analyzed project documents from CLT to try to understand how they framed their activities and their goals and what they wanted to do with the project, as well as media articles to trace how this work was received, both internationally and locally. So I carried out about 40 interviews distributed among these portal villages that I have mentioned. So these that are run by the NGO CLT. So here in Colonia Carlos Peregrí, Concepción, San Miguel, and Ituzaingó. And I also visited the 2 centers that are run by CLT from where they release their animals and do all their activities. And what we did, and what is kind of a central part of the paper, to support the data collection and analysis, we used a recently developed theoretical framework, and it's called the Protected Area Assets Framework. And it was designed to illuminate the benefits of protected areas to people and to explore how they generate value, as well as how these values were distributed or are distributed. And the idea is basically that this could help justify the existence and expansion of protected areas to local stakeholders and decision makers. And I use this also to understand the rewilding project as such. It can kind of be adapted to work on projects as well. And here, obviously, we use the framework to evaluate a project, but it could also be used within planning and adaptive management. So it was, as you can see, it's been around since 2014. I think the publication came out in 2017, actually. So it was quite new when I applied it. And it consists of these 5 categories that you can see here. So biophysical assets, human assets, infrastructure assets, institutional assets, and cultural assets. I will not dwell on it much more here, but what it does is basically to order intrinsic and quantifiable assets of a particular area into these categories to help you kind of trace them along the way as the project proceeds. So what we did, just to put it simply, is to explore how the contents of each of these areas have changed during the last 20 years since the project has been running. And we focused primarily on local people's perception of what has changed and how they felt about it, and checked socioeconomic indicators to see how this matched with the measurable reality, if you will. In this next section, I will just take you through the results of the research, and I will briefly talk about what the project managers did within each of these categories that I mentioned in order to achieve their project aims. So and also talk a little bit about the impact on the social and ecological system of Ibera, and how they were impacted basically by the project. So let's begin with the first category, biophysical assets. CLT's first investment, as I mentioned a little bit in the background, was the purchase of land from private owners between 1997 and 2002. And this was followed by continuous investment into ecological restoration of this land, such as prescribed burnings, removal of agricultural infrastructure, fencing, as you can see here, to try to get it back into a more natural flowing dynamic. And in 2007, CLT initiated their fauna reintroductions, starting with giant anteaters, this cool guy right here. And in 2017, they had released or translocated more than 250 animals into the wild, including pampas deer. Let's see, yeah, here we go. Collared peccaries, green-winged macaws, maned wolf, and tapirs, making it one of the most, ambitious fauna restoration projects on the American continents. In 2018, Ibera saw the birth of its first jaguar cubs in over a century in the area. So this is kind of the last element of the fauna reintroduction, is the apex predator, the jaguar. So this is kind of becoming the emblem of the Rewilding project and creating quite a buzz in the international arena about it. And at the same time, what CLT has done has been, they have been extremely adept at giving faces and names to all of these animals, particularly the cutest ones, planting stories about them in the local media, these kind of heart-wrenching tales about rescued cubs, as well as awe-inspiring photos of jaguars and such. And particularly the case of jaguars have been almost like a soap opera, with partner matching and love triangles and the quest for cubs that have all been communicated through local media and the newspapers and other types of sources. And it's been quite popular with local people. There have been hotels named by the jaguars and so on. So let's move on to the human assets. And basically, when CLT came in, they needed to gain the trust of local and regional politicians, as well as local people. And one of the key elements to gain this trust was to let the project be taken over, basically, bit by bit, by local people. So CLT built the stewardship by employing local people as area managers and provided environmental education in schools, as well as workshops to enhance nature-based enterprises and many other initiatives. So they primarily identified young and entrepreneurial individuals that were open to new ideas and that could represent these ideas in the local communities and basically start spreading them from the ground up. And they also hired staff to conduct advocacy and outreach to gain the support of regional institutions, as well as recognition within the academic domain. So they took in researchers to produce papers and in other ways try to spread the project. And to reach those who were primarily preoccupied with the low levels of socioeconomic development of the area, CLT invented this concept, production of nature, or producción de la naturaleza, as you can see here. It's a slogan, you could say, with which they could promise these explicit and tangible benefits from the national park by using it to create business opportunities, for instance, through ecotourism. So basically promising that there would be not just a protected barrier and that people were not able to access it, but they would be included and it would be a beneficial project for them. And this concept became the base of a campaign to illuminate the potential of the area as an economic engine. And this brings me onwards to the cultural assets. And because CLT also made investments to develop the potential of the area's cultural heritage. Because the area here in Corrientes is defined by very strong cultural identities and traditions, and many of them are actually unique for the wetlands. One of them is the modes of transportation used by the hunters that you can see in the image when I talked about the hunters, which is a canoe that they steer with a long kind of punting pole through the wetland, or sometimes they attach a horse to a canoe that either the horse walks or the horse swims when the water is deep enough to get out into the wetland. And the customs that they could identify that were compatible with the project were tweaked and included in different programs. For instance, this mode of transport with horses are now used to guide tourists through the wetland, which is actually very popular. And as you can see here are these posters that are produced by CLT for the project. They also promoted these kind of different modes. This is the punting pole that I mentioned, within a campaign that connected the development of the national park to the restoration of biological and to cultural diversity and the cultural heritage of the area. So basically it was framed as a project to restore nature and restore the region's cultural roots. And this was obviously something that people could, at least in part, identify with and agree to. So the campaign do not feature, as you can see, any mention to Conservation Land Trust, to the managers. It's as if it's surged from the region itself. And this idea to kind of plant an idea and then step back is something that was also very typical of what the organization did. They waved no flags, but tried to make the ideas and initiatives grow from the ground up. And this brings us to the last of the categories that I wanted to mention today, infrastructure assets. Is by purchasing these brown bits that I indicated to you before, which were just next to the wetland, they were able to open up more access routes into this wet core that I've been talking about, which was previously restricted to private landowners, right? So in the portals that they created by doing this, CLT funded the construction of campsites and improvement of roads and this coherent signing structure throughout all of the villages where they worked, basically trying in every way to make it accessible for ecotourism and also for local people to be able to enter the wetland, because many people lived right next to it but didn't really go there very much. And they also, something that is quite interesting that they did is to place all income generating activities, all the support that they did to create business opportunities and such, were placed in the villages. So not in the entry to the wetland itself, but in the village that was closest by this entry point. And this was a strategy to basically anchor the business and make it be run by people, local people, to create an incentive basically to sustain the natural area in good conditions. So all the tourists need to pass through this village or these villages in order to get into the wetland. So they will hire their guide there, they will sleep there. Basically, this creates a really good business opportunity for many of these villages. So let's just briefly then go over the impacts, right? I go through this much more detail in the paper, and I just wanted to summarize it all here by going through this model a little bit here, this illustration that I did. So let's look first of all at the values that have been created for institutions, so for politicians, for Argentina as a state, and also for CLT as an organization. Because since the national park was established, which was just a few years ago, it's been a gradual process. It's been really acknowledged as a success, and it's put Ibera on the map, and it's created a lot of attention for both CLT as an organization, but also for politicians who eventually started buying into these ideas and getting aboard on the project. And they had all this recognition have given access to new funding networks. It has created new plans for the area, not only for development of ecotourism, but as also infrastructure that has to do with basically the living standards of the area. So there's been a lot of development. And the concept that I mentioned, production of nature, has quite astonishingly made it all the way up to the national level. I talked to some people within the management of national parks in Argentina, and who said that production of nature is now pretty much a policy of the Argentinian state. I don't know how widespread it is, but what I do know is that there are now more initiatives to do similar projects in other national parks in Argentina, where CLT has also been asked to help out, and basically they're being consulted as some type of a rewilding authority to help run similar models elsewhere. And looking at the economy, there's been quite a significant diversification within the business sector in these villages. As I mentioned, these were pretty much exclusively agricultural focused before, particularly for men who were working with the livestock and such. So this diversification has been really good for particularly young people and women who are starting up businesses and starting up guide operations and such. And this has kind of reversed a tendency of agricultural rural depopulation, where people used to leave to look for jobs elsewhere. A lot of young people are actually now staying in their villages to try to develop their initiatives there. So that's a big change that we were able to observe. One example is the Pellegrini village that I mentioned, where around 80% of the local people now subsist from ecotourism. A lot of hostels have been developed, for example. This was made by CLT into this kind of model village. They supported them to develop all these initiatives. And then local people, there are now obviously more opportunities for them to develop both new ideas, but also adhere to their local traditions. And the area is becoming quite famous for both nature and culture, right? And this improved social cohesion and pride, that people felt that this is no longer just a poor area that is overlooked, but people actually stay here, and the National Geographic comes several times a year the last couple of years to film here and to understand what we are doing here. So that has really changed things. And being from Ibera, as I said, is becoming associated with something positive. And lastly, for nature, obviously, the rewilding and restoration have enabled a substantial bounce back of fauna populations and also of natural processes. And particularly capybaras and alligators have bounced back and are now almost overabundant in the area. And although there's been many difficulties along the way, for example, learning how to make macaws fly, it was not an obvious process, as you might think, because they were reintroduced from captive populations. So it's been quite a challenge to train them how to fly. Most of the rewilded species are now also on quite a good road to creating stable populations in the wetlands as well. So basically, just to summarize a little bit, CLT and the Tompkins have gone from these land-grabbing Yankee intruders to an accepted and valued partner nationally, holding a permanent place in decision-making bodies, and they are also well on track to achieving most of their aims with this area and this project. Ibera is now a national park, not all of it, but the parts that were the property of CLT are now a national park. So basically, it's bits of national parks surrounding the provincial park. And it is in the process of being taken over by Argentina and run by national stakeholders. So basically, CLT is slowly stepping back and starting to focus on other projects in Argentina and elsewhere. So why and how did this happen, basically? So we identified some key mechanisms that were helpful in building this legitimacy, because the legitimacy has obviously been the most important element in making this project successful. Without local people and local politicians, it would have been impossible. And these four factors, let's begin with the first one, making conservation comprehensible. Because as you all may know and think about sometimes, is the discipline of conservation can quite often be technocratic. We do use a lot of lingo, and yeah, it might be hard to relate to if you're living in an area where you've always been living in nature. So justification that may seem irrelevant have here been made relevant, and the Rewilding project has been very helpful with this. Remember the stories I mentioned before? They have been really important in creating this public engagement for the campaigns. And they were very effective at creating understanding and engagement for these animals, these individuals, and the need to dedicate space for them, and for the need to restore wildness or wilderness, however you want to phrase it, so that they can be somewhere. It seems to be this power of cute and impressive animals is almost unbeatable. So let's bring on the second point, which is integrating biodiversity and cultural conservation. Yeah, there we go. Because conservation efforts often falter if they fail to engage with the history and local traditions of a place. And I think that Ibera clearly illustrates the benefits of simultaneously protecting both biological and cultural diversity. In Ibera, this was essential to enable people to identify with the project and thereby create the stewardship that CLT was looking for when people were able to run the project from the ground, basically. And thirdly, being accountable and providing proof of concept. So CLT has been very good at continuously communicating results and showing a model for rewilding and ecotourism that has worked. So this model village of Carlos Pellegrini, for example, has been very important to illustrate that the ecotourism model that CLP was talking about initially actually worked. And through connecting the different villages and spreading the information between them, it was really a very important element to spread this good development among the villages. And lastly, just to build on the local, identifying what is typical, the idiosyncrasies of an area, and illuminate them and build from them. And by doing this, CLT increased the perceived value of these local resources while also promoting local people to develop them. And in combination with stronger networks, as I mentioned, of transfer of information, it enhanced the prospect of sustainable livelihoods developed by the citizens themselves. So today, CLT has access to political networks and has become a strategic partner of decision-making bodies from the local to the national level. And Ibera is an area in transition, and these transitions are bringing direct and indirect livelihood improvements for the villages, for example, through upgraded infrastructure, more social cohesion, and more employment opportunities. So, as I mentioned, many challenges remain, and new ones keep popping up all the time. For instance, in relation to the unpredictability of the tourism industry, which have these defined highs and lows. I don't really know what's happened now in COVID, what the situation has been on the ground. I imagine that it hasn't, been easy. There's also an issue with rising land prices. So local people are finding it more difficult to buy land. And there are also some emerging issues with governance and disenfranchisement of local people that are feeling, as the project is becoming more and more successful and more economic resources are flowing in, that they are losing touch with local people. Obviously this model is no panacea. I'm currently in Spain, as Adam mentioned, and doing fieldwork here for my PhD. So it's curious, I actually, through a funny coincidence, ran into one of the project managers that were leading the project in 2017 when I was there. He's now in Spain trying to develop a similar project right here. And he was just telling me that many of the principles that he had been working with in Ibera did not work at all in Spain. It was obviously very different conditions, but I suppose this point just illustrates the importance of place-based approaches, that there is no magic formula. So I think, let me just pass on to this point. I just wanted to say that, I can actually just pass back here, that the case study of Ibera, when all is said and done, for me illustrates that it is possible to build legitimacy for conservation and achieve rural development by using such a place-based approach, right? When you get it right, it can really work and it can be instrumental to create the sustainability of an area. And just from my end and the research perspective, analyzing this project through the asset framework that I mentioned has been really helpful. It helped us to structure the data and to understand how this was possible. So we think that the framework can actually be quite helpful for other managers or researchers like me to try to get to grips with both the explicit and implicit elements, the things that can be valued and the things that cannot be valued or put a price on within different projects, and the different forms of value that has been created, basically. So there are certain limitations as well to the framework, and we discussed this more in the paper, but our findings support that it's basically useful to use this framework as a measure to measure a project and aid conservation planning. So just to conclude with one sentence, that when restoration and protection of ecosystems is harmonized with the needs and aspirations of local communities, it can generate lasting benefits and greatly increase the prosperity of both humans and wildlife. So with that, I need to actually change the picture. And I want to thank you for your attention. I don't really know how I am in time. I hope I haven't really gone over too much. And if there is any question, I would love to take them. So thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, Hanna. Why don't I don't know if you can see the chat window, Hanna, but I'm happy to read out the questions for you.
Yes, that would be great, actually, because I cannot see the chat right now.
If anybody has questions, just bump them into the group chat and then we'll just go through them. So first question is, what are the chances that the land allocated to this project will be reassigned to other purposes in the next decade or so?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I think that is going to be the factor that in the end tells us if this project has been successful or not. If CLT has managed to really anchor and create the stewardship that I have been talking about throughout. Because when I was there in 2017 and I was talking to a lot of local people, it seemed very promising. People were talking a lot about the benefits and about the initiatives that they were wanting to develop within the national park, given the resources that were there. But as CLT is backing off now and handing over the management of the park to local people and to the Argentinian states, well, basically that is the baptism of fire for this area. The probabilities, I suppose, will depend on the general trends of the economic systems as well. And we were actually discussing before if COVID is going to be helpful to change the way we think about nature, more and more people piling in to visit national parks and such, which may or may not be helpful. I suppose I should say I don't know, but from what I could see, the change of the communities from just purely agricultural to this diversification and the improved infrastructure and opportunities do point in a good direction for me.
You also cover a bit of pad, discussion in your paper as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Thanks, Hanna. Next question is, do you have any issues with human-wildlife conflict or perceptions that translocating species could lead to more conflict?
Yes, that's also a very good question. And one project could be dedicated entirely to the jaguar introduction, right? They actually did conduct a pre-survey. They did a questionnaire survey before the jaguars were in place to check out what people thought about the idea of reintroducing jaguars. And they were astonished to find really, really positive attitudes towards jaguars. And then they built this center where the jaguars are now in captivity, and they will successively be reintroduced into the wetlands. So right now, I think they're in one of the final stages before actually letting them out. But anyway, after having built this center and getting the jaguars there, they did a new survey and found that the attitude has changed significantly because people suddenly saw them and realized, oh shit, that could potentially be in my back garden any of these days. So that will, I think, be one of the really, really big issues going ahead, and also test the strength of the work that CLT has done to prepare the communities for this step, right? Because if the jaguars start attacking livestock, I see similar tendencies here in Spain when wolves start attacking livestock. It's really difficult to keep conflict from surging, right? The hopes of CLT is that the jaguars will have enough food in the wetland core and that will be coherent enough for them to stay there, basically. But that remains to be seen. Introductions of jaguars haven't really been done in this way, so I suppose we really don't know what's going to happen. If the jaguars will be happy and content just eating capybaras and alligators, or if they will go for some yummy cattle as well. The other wildlife is not very conflictive. The anteaters are great. I mean, they don't really attack anyone, and none of the other animals as well, particularly now that people know more about them. They've actually mostly been helpful, I think, because people find them interesting, and they know that people want to come and see them. So yeah, it really does depend on the species that is being reintroduced, and also the cultural kind of connotations attached with them.
Great, thanks, Hanna. So if there are multiple villages involved in this, and economic development can contribute to competition amongst the villages, so has there been a sense of how the project as a whole is handling limited benefits to some villages and not others, and perhaps driving conflict between people?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually, because obviously sometimes ecotourism is hailed as this panacea. Everybody should just become a guide and start bringing tourists out into the wetland. Obviously, there's only so many tourists every year, and they tend to go to the place that has the most infrastructure and that is the most attractive. In this case, Carlos Pellegrini, the village I've been mentioning continuously, is where most people go. And that obviously means that less people go to the other villages. When I was there, Pellegrini was quite developed, and the other ones were really just incipient, where things were developing bit by bit. So there will probably be a competition over the tourists. They try to develop separate things. So one village, for example, has a museum with local traditions and customs, and another one has an interpretation center, and a third one, for example, focus more on boat tours and stuff like that. So that's something that CLT is trying to do, create different niches. But that's why I think it's important to mention infrastructure, for example, as a very important element, that because the infrastructure is improving, there's just a general improvement of standard. So the roads are better, there are initiatives to build hospitals. Generally, there are just more stuff available in the villages. So even if not all people can live by ecotourism there are things that are improving, that have been connected to the project, that make people feel that even if you're not a tour operator, that things are getting better for them too. So yeah, going forwards, not sure. I suppose this trying to emphasize the different elements of each village will be important, but it is important to mention that I only have 4 villages within my study, and there are many more, and which are barely mentioned. And obviously you might feel a bit overlooked if you're in the next village and not included in the project. Yeah,
Hanna, this was my question. I remember hearing a story from some colleague who was working with the Adirondacks in New York, and that they had been experiencing this kind of amongst villages, and they went through a process of trying to encourage them to specialize. So this was the pottery village, and this was the village, so that encouraged people to visit to actually then move around from village to village and see all the different sites. So it's sort of regional specialization, and that was based on a European model that had really successfully reduced that kind of inter-village competition for benefit from the park, and made everyone feel better about it.
Yeah, I think they also tried, because you can come at the wetland from different angles, right? So if you come from the north, you would go to one village and so on. The roads are still pretty, at least when I was there, was pretty not great. So you tend, if you don't want to, rattle all your internal organs for 2 hours, you might choose to go to one and not to the others. So there are many things that will need to keep developing. As I said, I only had time to go to some of the nearby villages, and I don't really know the situation in the other ones. It would be very interesting to see what people there feel about it all, because there's a lot of resources flowing in to those villages, right, that are adjacent to the national park. And I think it's a common issue for conservation when we really want to make sure that a place feel okay about a national park, for example. There's always going to be a cutoff, and there are always going to be people left out. I think that's true for these red RED Plus programs where people are paid to conserve a forest, for example, and the neighbor on the other side is not getting paid anything. This is something we really need to be thinking about going forwards, how we can make this better and more equal, the distribution.
Yeah, I guess I just had a quick question, and I kind of related to an earlier one from Mark Bergman about, the idea of land security over the next decade. And one of the challenges, you see in international community development is sort of the infrastructure maintenance costs and kind of keeping things up so you can get this influx of funding for a new bridge or a new dam or whatever it is. But if it is being turned over to the locals, how is that being resourced for a sort of a long-term sustainable vision? Or do you have a sense that, if CLT, moves on to another project, are things going to start crumbling? I know it's hard to predict, but if you had tax measures or anything that might help secure the infrastructure for the long run?
Yeah, it's a great question, because one of the things that is really fascinating by CLT is that they have a lot of money. It's kind of almost unusual to study a project that have so much money at their disposal, and also have some good collaborations with international organizations that give them, or foundations that give them even more resources. So they are extremely well funded, and they've been able to develop a lot of stuff just because they have these funding flows. And I mean, private protected areas, as it was, that Ibera was a private protected area in the beginning, right? These different areas might be a good new way of funding biodiversity conservation, right? A lot of people are talking about the need to try to attract philanthropists and businesses and other entities to try to fund biodiversity conservation. But then the question is always what happens when they leave, or when the money runs out, or yeah. And I think Ibera is going to be interesting in that way, because the idea, the ethics of CLT is to basically come in, establish a protected area, and then leave, and assume that the protected area, once it is established, will be there in perpetuity. Argentina is not a particularly, I mean, it's not one of the poorest countries, but it's not one of the richest countries either. And we do have a tendency all over the world of this degazettement of national parks, right? When money is tight. Right now, CLT is very much still involved, and I think still contributes some money into this. And if the national park is really successful, that is, if people visit it, if there's a lot of tourism, if there is an obvious benefit of local people from the national park as such, the idea would be that there would be no incentive to deregulate it, and there would also be an incentive, to answer your question, to keep it in good shape, right? If there's an explicit value for the state or from local people. If it fails for some reason, if people get tired of ecotourism and want something else, yeah, that is very hard to predict what's going to happen then.
Great. Well, I see we're getting close to 10 o'clock here in Pacific. Do you have another question, Mark? Or
well, I was just going to say, if no one else is throwing up questions, I'd ask another one. So one of the things that the U.S. National Parks is trying to do a better job with, is that hasn't been particularly well done, is working cooperatively with indigenous people. I'm just wondering if there are similar issues with this particular park and where they stand. So.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a really good question. And the element of that I really try to emphasize with this project, right, which what I think has made it so successful is that they did really try to engage with the local culture, right, and the local traditions and the symbolism and everything. They try to build all their buildings in a style that matched the local and incorporate these different traditions within the project. If you're cynical, you could say that it's almost like a little bit of a indoctrination, or just cherry picking the things that you like about a particular culture and incorporating it. But I think that it was done in a respectful and good way, and it was very important to make the project successful. And I think how they did this, how did they create these contacts with local people, was by reaching out. They identified some key individuals. If you go to a community, there will likely be a person or a few that is more outward facing, or that is kind of the first point of call. And they identified them, particularly the younger, more outward looking ones, the adventurous ones, and worked a lot with them, and then let them take the next step to be the contact, the link between the organization and the community. Almost trying to pretend that they planted an idea and then stepped back and pretended that the idea come from somewhere else that was local. And also, of course, incorporated local ideas. And I think that's important. So let's taking the example to the US, if the national park could identify these key community leaders or young people that are interested in these ideas of conservation, and create a good trust with them, a good conversation, and work with them as a link between the local communities. I think that would be really, really important. I think that's something that a lot of projects will have to do. Here in Spain, where I'm right now, the failure of contact, or the failure of communication between local communities and the administration is very problematic, and it creates a lot of issues in the system. So if you can create these links, I think it's very important.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and if there's any more questions or curiosity about the paper, just shoot me an email, or whatever way you want to reach out. You can find me on most social media, I think. I'm very excited to keep track roughly of this project as I do my other research. So any news or just discussions, it's very interesting to me.
Okay, well, thank you. Go ahead, Adam, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to Hanna, and also point out to the audience that Hanna's paper is part of a contribution to a broader special issue titled Methods for Integrated Assessment of Human-Wildlife Interactions and Coexistence in Agricultural Landscapes. That's being put together in Conservation Science and Practice. That should come out in February or March of 2021. So have a look for that, because there'll be other excellent work like Hanna's kind of bundled up and accessible for all you folks working in this field.
Okay, thank you. And join us again next week for the final seminar in the series. Thanks, and I'll stop the recording.
Hanna.